This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for October 30th, 2018, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cub Zero Ids?
Christina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, Checkers.
And not as usual, special guest, Barry Panas.
Hi.
We have a great show for you today. Barry is going to investigate errors in textbooks.
Oh.
And then Pat is going to look into passwords. Do you need one? Should you get one by now? Probably. But first, Adam, was there a terrible anti-vaccine article in the Toronto Sun?
Now, this weekend, while browsing the TRC Twitter account, at TRC_podcast.
Great podcast.
Great Twitter account.
Great Twitter handle.
I stumbled upon an article in the Toronto Sun with the title, What You May Not Know About Vaccines. That's kind of a deceptive title. I thought maybe there's something good in here. Well, actually, I didn't think that because of the comment that someone put with the retweet. Now, this article discouraged people from getting the flu shot, drew a link between vaccines and autism, and suggested vitamin C megadosing as an alternative. Needless to say, everything about it was wrong. On Pat's advice, I tweeted it at a few health professionals, and the reaction was the kind of thing we like to see in the skeptical community. Now, I've never lived in Toronto, only visiting on occasion, so the Toronto Sun isn't a paper I have intimate familiarity with. Now, I understand the paper has a reputation for being conservative. Would our Toronto chapter of TRC or Darren have any thoughts to share on this?
It's very much like those UK magazines that you may see, and it is very right-leaning. Not that there's anything specifically wrong with that, but
it's not that bad compared to some of the UK ones. They're absurd.
Oh, no,
it's not like the National Enquirer, just for people who don't know. It is a right-leaning magazine that is a bit more sensational for sure, and a bit more shock value and visceral.
Now, the article in question was in the diet and fitness section of the paper. I don't know why you put medical advice in there. Maybe it didn't have a better section to put it. It was written by W. Gifford Jones, MD, also known as Dr. Ken Walker. Those two names aren't really close to each other. I am not myself a medical doctor, and neither are any of my co-hosts, but luckily a lot of health experts did weigh in on this article, including a great breakdown by Science-Based Medicine's David Gorski, which I used to prepare this segment. Now, this seems like a good enough time to give a bit of a refresher on some basics about vaccines. The article opens with this disappointing comment. Every year, readers ask me if I get flu shots. I reply, I don't. I rely on high daily doses of vitamin C to build up my immune system. What's odd to me about this claim is that it's not even the usual nonsense you hear about vitamin C, which is usually said to protect against the common cold. This is also unfounded, and research has not shown vitamin C to protect against the cold. Only weak evidence suggests a potentially shorter cold in some patients, but this is not terribly convincing. There is no evidence that megadosing works. This was first suggested by Linus Pauling back in the 1970s. It was nonsense then, and still is now, but it is commonly repeated. This is a common thing that people think about when they talk about colds.
And how many Nobel Prizes do you have, Adam? 0. Linus has 2, which means he's twice as smart as you.
Well, I'm working on my first one, and I'm still quite young.
Argument from authority is a logical fallacy, folks.
Were it true for a cold virus, it would potentially be true for other viruses like the flu, Ebola, and HIV, but it isn't true for any of these. Side fact, Gifford Jones does actually claim vitamin C could be used to avoid Ebola. Gifford Jones goes on to claim that neurotoxins in vaccines can sometimes lead to inflammatory reactions affecting the nervous system, which leads to autism. The vaccine autism link is so outdated, but it keeps creeping up. It has been thoroughly discredited. The idea is that thimerosal, a form of mercury found in vaccines, caused autism.
Oh, actually, if I could jump in there, I'll fact check you on this on the spot.
Sure.
Okay, so just a clarification. Thimerosal isn't itself a form of mercury. It's a preservative in some vaccines, and it does contain a form of mercury that's called ethyl mercury.
So still doesn't cause autism, but thank you for the clarification, Barry. Now, even before these claims started to gain popularity early this century, the U.S. FDA had already asked for thimerosal levels to be reduced significantly Though thimerosal doesn't cause autism, it also isn't in a lot of the vaccines that are claimed to cause autism, that being childhood vaccines that are given around the age slightly before autism generally sets on, which I think why people have this intuitive sense that this might be what's going on. This is historically related to the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella. That said, thimerosal does still appear in the flu shot. Now, it has not been in childhood vaccines for years, and the autism rate has not decreased, so that's one indication we have that thimerosal is not the cause of autism. There really is no evidence that thimerosal or any other ingredients in vaccines or vaccines themselves are the cause of autism. So people kind of keep trying to move that goalpost and saying, well, maybe it's not thimerosal, but maybe there's something else, or maybe it's just something about the vaccines that's causing this. And it's all nonsense. And so you hear people talking about different preservatives or different ingredients, and there's been no link found. So similarly, there's an idea that children are exposed to vaccines too young, which might contribute to autism. This is also unfounded. The reason there are more vaccines now is because there are more preventable illnesses that we are immunized against, and this is a good thing, and this is why we do not die as children at very high rates, which is great. Now, the next claim that he makes is that vaccines cause SIDS, also known as sudden infant death syndrome. It's a term used to encompass a sudden and unexplained death of children under the age of 1. By the very fact that there's no known cause of SIDS, this means that people do not know it to be caused by vaccines. It doesn't mean we're not sure, and it could be a cause. This has been investigated, and there has been no link shown between vaccines and SIDS. One potential risk factor for SIDS is infants sleeping on their stomach. If it's something that you're concerned about, there are things that can reduce the chances of SIDS, such as having a child sleeping in the same room as the parents, for example. And it's just, if there's a problem with the child, the parents can react more quickly. So who's this guy who wrote this article? W. Gifford Jones, MD, also known as Dr. Ken Walker, has a syndicated column which runs in a number of Canadian newspapers, as well as some in US and Europe. It's just weird that his pseudonym for writing his columns isn't just his normal professional name, but yeah, he has a pseudonym which he uses for his column.
Given the large amount of hate mail he might get, maybe that's why.
Maybe. I don't know. He's been, he's over 90 years old. He's been in the business for a long time. This may have been a decision he made decades ago. So this particular article was in the Toronto Sun and was also in some other newspapers, but the Toronto Sun is really a huge paper, and this is why it was a big deal and had a large reaction from a lot of people. So obviously we see claims like this in small blogs here and there every once in a while, but if they don't get traction, it's not really worth commenting on to the same extent. Now, Gifford Jones regularly argues against the flu vaccine, sometimes citing things that aren't mentioned in this article, such as that it causes Alzheimer's disease. He is anti-GMO, believing that they will cause half of all children to be autistic by 2035. So I guess that means that he thinks there are two different things that cause autism. As for the vitamin C nonsense, would you believe that Gifford Jones actually sells a vitamin C supplement, Medi-C+, which he does recommend in this piece? So, yeah, kind of terrible conflict of interest, of course. Ultimately, after the massive amount of attention this article got on social media, looks like the Sun took note. Sunday afternoon, the Toronto Sun's editor-in-chief, Adrienne Batra, mentioned on Twitter that the opinion piece was taken offline following a number of inaccuracies pointed out by a number of medical professionals, and she encouraged people to get vaccines. So, good on her and good on the Toronto Sun. Obviously, it would have been better if it never got published in the first place, but that's what it is. Vaccines do not cause autism. They also don't cause SIDS or Alzheimer's disease. Vitamin C megadosing using products such as Gifford Jones's Medi-C Plus will not prevent the flu, or Ebola for that matter. The flu shot is your best bet at preventing the flu, not only in yourself, but in others who are at risk, including the immunocompromised, the elderly, and infants. This is why I plan on getting the shot this year, to protect not only myself, but my growing family. Good on all of the medical doctors and health professionals who tackled the nonsense in this article with solid, well-researched evidence which convinced the Toronto Sun's editorial team that this is not something they should have in their paper.
Hear, hear. It really was a terrible article, but written in a way that'd be very compelling for people who already believe this sort of thing.
Absolutely. And when I first read it, I was like, oh, the way he kind of explains, and this causes inflammation, which can cause this, and I'm not really sure, and you should take a doctor's advice, but it causes autism, you know?
Yeah. It's basically one big post hoc fallacy. After that, therefore, because of that. And people have trouble just not committing that fallacy.
Yeah.
Now, many moons ago, Pat gave one of his wonderful games of Name That, and there was a question about the mass of the water on the Earth compared to the mass of the whole Earth. And I happened to say the value of the mass of the Earth was 5.98 times 10 to the 24 kilograms. Mm-hmm. Now, our good friend Barry Panas wrote in saying, well, great memory, Darren, but that's not quite true. But your answer is close, and actually I thought it was the same because you'll find that number in various textbooks, but the actual mass of the Earth is 5.972 times 10 to the 24 kilograms. And this led to an interesting conversation that, these various numbers and constants and facts we might learn in textbooks aren't always accurate, and there happen to be errors in textbooks. And here to tell us more about those errors is Barry Panas. He's a high school physics teacher in Winnipeg, also a former president of the Manitoba Association of Physics Teachers, an advanced placement physics college board consultant, and he's traveled around the world giving training for advanced placement physics teachers. Take it away, Barry.
Okay, so just to get the record straight, I wasn't suggesting that this be a literal correction on the show because it's a very, very small point. It's just a one-digit kind of a thing here. But I did think I would just raise it to your attention just to, have that bigger conversation about how you can't always trust things in textbooks. And this is just a weird one. I don't know how this exactly got started. It is in quite a few textbooks, the mass of the Earth being given to, like three figures as 5.98, when, if anything, it should be reported as 5.97. Again, just a small quibbly point here, but what I suspect happened at some point in the past is that somebody decided that was a nicer number to work with, because if you work backwards using the high school physics that it's usually in that context, you kind of work backwards to calculate something that we like to say, that the gravitation at the surface of the Earth is 9.8. So if you use this rounded off 9.8 and kind of work backwards to calculate the mass of the Earth, you get something closer to 5.98. In any case, it's wrong, and it's just kind of interesting because what I think happened is textbook writers after textbook writers after textbook writers, they kind of reference other books, so it just becomes part of the mythology almost that this is the mass of the Earth.
Now, just a quick interjection. While it is just one number, we are using the 10 to the 24 exponent, which that decimal point would be 10 to the 22. So it's like 10 billion trillion. So although it's one number, it's a lot.
Well, what's a few billion among friends?
Exactly.
And of course, percentage-wise, which is what we're probably more prone to think at this point, it's just a smaller detail. I wouldn't really be too worried about it. In fact, I still lapse just out of old habits into using the wrong number myself in my classroom. Sometimes catch myself, but it's a habit that's hard to break because throughout my schooling itself, I always thought it was 5.98. So on the exact same note, the radius of the Earth in a lot of high school textbooks, at least, is given as 6.38 times 10 to the 6. It's 6.371, which should be rounded to 6.37 and not 6.38. I remember very clearly my first experience with this. I think I was a first-year teacher, maybe in my second year, and I distinctly remember this so clearly. I had given my students an assignment, something along the lines of, hey, for tomorrow I want you to do the first 10 questions in your textbook. And being a new teacher, I don't think I had even read the questions myself. So the next day in class, we were going over them, and we came across a question that I really was at a loss for. The question, which is like burned into my mind, even though this was a long time ago, was literally this. Question: in what situation, give an example, that momentum is not conserved? Now, when I read that literally to my class as we were going over it, I was completely at a loss. I was basically saying, well, that's a weird question because there really is no situation in which momentum isn't conserved. But hang on, I've got the teacher edition of the textbook here, right? So it has all of the, quote, answers in it. So I said, give me a minute, I'll see what they're trying to get at here. Maybe I was missing some nuance or something. So I read the official, teacher edition from the publisher, answer to the question, which said something to the effect of, well, in certain collisions, some of the momentum is converted into heat. Now, from a physics point of view, that's just really, really terrible. So it was maybe a bit overdramatic, but I read that out loud to my class, and then literally threw the textbook across the room. It hit the wall, the cover fell off, And I did have to keep using that book for a while longer until I could replace it, but I immediately had a bit of an awakening that, wow, just because it's in the textbook doesn't mean that it's correct and reliable.
Now, Barry, how much hotter was the wall after the book hit it?
Yeah,
was
some
this
of
a
the
discussion of
momentum,
aerodynamics and force and gravity?
definitely some of the momentum was converted into heat there.
Yeah.
Certainly, or at least the anger was converted into heat. 'Cause I was kind of at a loss and really disappointed with this textbook. It just kind of raised my awareness, and sure enough, I started noticing a number of other errors inside that textbook.
Wow.
So I'll give you a kind of an interesting example. It was in a different chapter. It was all about light, and the situation is kind of tricky, but I'll just say this much. It gave a paragraph-length explanation of a tricky thing about light, interference, and such. And it said, if you look at the picture, that accompanied the text, it makes sense because of the following physics. Well, the physics was fine, but the picture was upside down. And it was critical to making sense of the physics. Yeah. Like, it just didn't make sense. So I can only imagine how many students would read it, look at the picture, and say, well, I'm missing something. It doesn't make sense. Yeah. Read it again, look at the picture, and, kind of get confused by it and just assume that the error is in their misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Okay, so I saw that and, just made a note of it and warned my students about it. About a year later, I was actually down in the U.S. at a physics teacher conference, and the publisher of that textbook was there pitching their book.
The same book?
In fact, the same book, except it was, at that time, one edition newer than the one I had.
Sure.
It was, now, of course, just a salesperson that's kind of manning the booth, if you will, but I went to him and was talking about his textbook and how I didn't like it and how I found there were a number of errors in it. And he was, like what? And I said, well, for example, I mean, this one picture was upside down. And he said, well, we do have a new edition, so I'm sure that was caught. So we opened it up, like I was able to locate the same page, if you will. Same picture, upside down. So, and that's something that to me is a glaringly obvious mistake. I mean, if you're fact checking something like that, I mean, hopefully you have knowledgeable people who are looking for things like that in a textbook. But my lesson was that it's not always the case. It's just not always the case.
So maybe it's being proofread, but not being proofread for accuracy of content, just to make sure like things line up properly and there isn't a half a sentence here or something like that, right?
Well, yeah, and I suspect different textbooks have different levels of fact checking. I found a lot of textbooks are really, really good, just to be clear.
Yes.
But at the same time, you can't rely on them dependably. Another example, if I can indulge myself, is a common error that I have yet to find a high school level textbook that actually gets this correct. I've pointed it out to a lot of people, and most people are kind of like, well, maybe, but this is the way everybody does it. And it just drives me nuts. In physics, of course, we usually prefer to use the metric system and related units, but they usually at least mention some of the other units, especially a US-based textbook. We usually mention the pound as a unit. Mm-hmm. So every physics textbook that I've come across, when mentioning this, discusses the pound as a unit of force. Sort of like the Newton is, which is our preferred unit in physics. They'll even go so far as to say that 1 pound is equivalent to so many newtons. That's not correct. The pound is actually not a force unit. It's a mass unit. Mm-hmm. We should be comparing it directly to kilograms, not to newtons.
Or at least dollars.
Or dollars, yeah. So again, it just drives me nuts. So when I point this out to people, they just don't seem interested in fixing it.
Yeah.
And I even had a chat one time with a physics professor about it. I just asked. I said, "Well, help me out here because I want to make sure I'm correct about this.
Yes.
Is the pound a unit of force or is it a unit of mass?" And at least this particular professor said, "Well, it's a unit of force," which is, again, now I understand, definitely not correct. So I had a conversation with him and said, well, how can we settle this? Because this is not really a matter of opinion. Do we trust the textbooks or do we have to look for some authority?
Yep.
Well, I started digging into it and I looked up every authority possible here, right down to the International Bureau of Weights and Measurements in France, which, kind of governs units across the world, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the U.S., I even looked up, Canadian government websites because they have like formal definitions of units used for commerce, etc. All of these official bodies, right down to the government of Canada, correctly identifies the pound as a unit of mass.
Yeah.
and they all agree with each other, but the textbooks all have it flipped.
Wow.
So I literally can't explain why that is, but that's a pervasive error that just kind of drives me nuts every time I come across it. This was one that I actually had a back and forth with a couple of computer teachers who were telling me that a megabyte, etc., is 1,024 of kilobytes, and a kilobyte is 1,024 bytes, etc.
Yeah.
So you're familiar with these things? Some of these, yes.
Working at IT, yeah. Yeah.
You work in, okay, so we'll ask from an IT perspective, how many bytes are in a kilobyte?
How many bytes are in a kilobyte? My understanding, it's 1,024.
And that's not correct. A kilobyte is 1,000 bytes.
Well, I understand that kilo means 1,000, but my understanding is also that in IT terms, they always round it up to 1,024 when they do that conversion, right?
Right, and that's what the computer teacher that I talked to said also. Mm-hmm. So we had a back and forth, and I said, "Well, the kilo is a prefix for 1,000, and so on." Anyway, he couldn't believe me. He said, "Well, okay, I don't really care what you physics people do. We computer people do it this way." And I said, "Well, okay, then help me out here. Who would be your body that you would refer to kind of rely on these official definitions?" And he said, "Well, I guess that'd be something like the IEEE."
Yeah.
So I went to the IEEE website and found out something that I had personally never heard before. First of all, to be clear, they say a kilobyte has exactly 1,000 bytes in it. And the 1024 number that is rather handy, they have a different name for it that I've never heard anybody use. So ready for this? I'm not making this up.
Yep.
According to the IEEE, there is 1,000 exactly bytes in a kilobyte, but that other number, the 1,024, which is a kind of a natural number to use with base 2,
yes,
is properly called a kibibyte.
Oh.
Kibibytes, mebibytes, gibibytes, and so on.
How do you spell that?
Well, mebibyte, for example, would be MEBI. BYTE, a mebibyte.
But those are the numbers that are really used.
Right.
Like
so,
these numbers that you're not calling. So like I just pulled up a terminal on my computer here, and I compared an LS which just shows me the LS-LA, which shows me the size in bytes, and I compared it to an LS-LAH. The H makes it readable, and it shows me in kilobytes, for example. The number of bytes translates 1 to 1, but when it converts it to kilobytes, it's not 1,000 to 1, it's 1,024 to 1. So these are the numbers that we generally use. So if I'm looking at bytes, kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes in a human readable format, and that's, I'm pretty sure if you pull up like a Windows Explorer, it's going to give similar numbers. It's 1,024 that it's giving.
Right, and that's my point. That we have a kind of a discrepancy between what is practically done versus what the governing bodies, that we should be able to refer to for what we do, use. They actually say something a little bit different,
which is very frustrating because working in IT, I very much refer to things, I'll ask for a disk and I will ask for 100 gigabyte disk, and people understand what that means, and that's what's given to me, right? But it's really not a gigabyte at all. That's
that was
frustrating, right?
Question. So I thought a megabyte was 1,000,000 bytes and a gigabyte's 1,000,000,000 bytes. Is that inaccurate?
Well, okay, by my claim, that would be correct.
Sure.
But most people who are really computer savvy would disagree.
So it's 1,000. So it's 1,024 bytes to a kilobyte. It's 1,024 kilobytes to a megabyte. It's 1,024 megabytes to a gigabyte. So it's instead of being 1,000,
24,000 bytes.
Yeah. So it's always close to rounding it that way, but it just makes the math a little more complicated when you're actually looking at the files, right?
Right, but you can imagine the opportunity for miscommunication.
Absolutely.
So let's say that somebody who is really kind of coming from a physics background like myself is talking to somebody who has primarily a computer background. There may be occasions where it's critical that we're communicating clearly, right down to the byte, so to speak. So there are these discrepancies that are out there. The thing that I find interesting, I mean, I don't really care how many bytes you think are in a kilobyte if it's practical and you use it.
Yes.
But at the same time, the official bodies that, define these terms, are not being used in many cases. Yeah, it's one of those interesting things. So consider it trivia at this point. I'm certainly not on a mission to go and correct people on the use.
Well, now it's going to bother me because
term.
this is things I see all the time, right? And now I don't know how pedantic I want to be when I talk about it with people.
I want to say it's not Barry's mission, but now it is our listeners' mission to annoy their friends who will no longer be their friends if they keep talking about this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Barry, and hopefully those textbooks out there will get corrected some way, somehow.
Yeah.
And now we turn to Pat. Abracadabra. I assume that's the right password to get him to speak.
I think I've mentioned this on the show more than once, but I listen to a lot of podcasts. Hours of them every day on a variety of topics. And one of my guilty pleasures is shows about information security and hacking. Now, some people might prefer that I use the word cracking, but I think people know what I'm referring to here. It's a subject that has been of interest to me for years, and I've done some training in the field of IT security. I've talked about doing more of these types of segments on the show, and I might try and do that. I know Adam also has some expertise in the field as well. So over the weekend, I listened to a couple of podcasts. The first is called Hacking Humans by the Cyberwire. They had an episode called Easier to Trick Than to Hack, and they had an interview with Naked Security writer Mark Stockley about why we humans have such a hard time creating secure passwords. We all have many online accounts, and each one of them has a password. Security experts tell us we should have a unique password for each of our accounts, and we should make them hard to crack by using upper and lowercase characters and numbers and symbols, and we should make them long, and we shouldn't write them down. As Carol Theroux, an IT professional who conducts the interview, points out, it seems like remembering all these random long passwords would be nearly impossible. Stockley sees a disconnect between how our brains work and what good password creation requires, because we're not designed around producing randomness, we're designed around creating order. And when it comes to good passwords, that's a weakness. So if a password requires a capital letter, most people will put it at the beginning. If a password requires a number, most people will put it at the end. If we have 25 online accounts and we need strong passwords for each of them, we're faced with a problem. So instead, most of us do one of three things. Number one, we use weak passwords. Every year, a company called Splash Data releases a list of the 25 worst passwords. In 2017, the list was compiled using data from 5 million leaked passwords for users in North America and Western Europe. If you hear one of your passwords in this list, pause the podcast and go change it. All right, here are a few. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Password. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. QWERTY. Let me in. Football. I love you. Welcome. Monkey. Login. ABC 1, 2, 3. Star Wars.
I gotta go, guys.
You're like A New Hope, the Jedi, the strikes. Anyway.
All right, yep.
Dragon. Password with a 0 instead of an O. Hello. Freedom. Whatever. And trust no one with the digit 1. Or number 2, and I think most people are guilty of this. We reuse the same password over and over again, which adds a lot of value to a would-be thief. Maybe you aren't so concerned that there was a data breach of LinkedIn accounts, but do you use the same credentials, usually your email and your password, on your Uber account, or your eBay account, or your PayPal account, or for online banking? Or number 3, the other thing people do is use a formula. You know, you use some sort of root password and then vary it according to some formula based on the service you're using. They discuss this practice as doing a lot of work for a would-be hacker. The more structure you put into your passwords, the easier they are to guess. Dave Bittner, the host of Hacking Humans, says he's guilty of this as well. He thought he was being clever until a colleague suggested they could try and hack his passwords. Bittner agreed. Shortly after that, the colleague sent him a list of a dozen of his passwords. They discuss some research from Virginia Tech that says if you use a base password and just augment it slightly for your next password, it can usually be guessed in under 10 guesses. So what do they suggest? While many companies are doing a better job of helping users pick better passwords, others could do more. Companies should ban at least the top 100 worst passwords. Companies should have incremental lockouts. You get 3 guesses, and if you get it wrong, you're locked out for 10 minutes. Do it 3 more times, you're locked out for the day. Finally, they think that 2-step authentication, like where you get a code text to your phone, can be really helpful.
Or that can be a huge pain if you change your phone number and then you can't get into a specific account. For example, my Google account that I needed to get into at some point.
Of course, and getting locked out of your account for getting 3 wrong guesses, that's a pain in the ass too. But
that is huge.
Yeah. But ultimately, the best way is for you to pick strong, random passwords. But now we come back to the original problem. If you have 25 accounts, how are you going to remember these passwords? Stockley says, don't even try. Everyone on the show's recommendation is to use a password manager. This is usually a locally installed software application or an online service that you access through a web portal. It creates strong passwords and stores them in an encrypted database or locally on the user's device or through an online file hosting service. Depending on the type of manager, it normally requires a user to remember one master password that unlocks access to all your other passwords. There are reasons this is not perfect, and you certainly want to find a service that you trust, but most security professionals suggest this is the best way to go. Okay, maybe we can get into this stuff a bit more on another show. How are passwords stored? How are they hacked? What is a dictionary attack? Or what is a rainbow table? But I really want to move on to something related. I mentioned the reuse of passwords, and I'm guilty of this. The problem is, if your credentials are compromised from one system, a cracker can try those credentials on another system.
Yeah.
So I listened to another podcast this weekend called Darknet Diaries. This is a show which tells true stories about the dark side of the internet. The episode that caught my interest was called The Peculiar Case of the VTech Hacker. This is a story of a 2015 data breach where a hacker obtained the personal data of 5 million parents and over 200,000 children from VTech, the game and electronic learning product manufacturer. In addition, the hacker also got tens of thousands of photos of the children taken by the company's devices and stored on their servers.
Wow.
That just sent a chill up my spine.
The story was first reported by Vice's Motherboard, who were contacted directly by the hacker, who said he wasn't going to do anything with the data, he just wanted the problem to be fixed. In order to verify that the breach was real, Motherboard enlisted the help of Troy Hunt. Troy is a well-known security expert and is often the go-to guy for journalists when there are data breaches. He was able to confirm from Motherboard that this was indeed a real and recent data breach. He did that by cross-matching the data given to Motherboard by the hacker with his own very large email database, and he asked his users whether the information was accurate. His users of what, you might ask? Hunt runs a database, IHaveBeenPwned.com.
Oh.
The site allows users to check if their personal data has been compromised in data breaches. As of November 2017, the site contains records of over 4.5 billion accounts from more than 250 data breaches.
Wow.
A user can go in with their email address and see if their information is part of one or more of those breaches. They can also see what information was obtained. You can also sign up to be notified if your address shows up in a future breach.
So to actually have this database, it would have to be a data breach where the data breach is all publicized?
So exactly, Darren. These are data breaches where the data has shown up on the dark web.
Now I would almost have concern even with using that site just by putting my name in there. Maybe,
well, right. How do you know?
It suggests that it's being actively used and that person might be sharing passwords with other accounts, so then might, maybe it puts them to a top of but I guess it depends on how much you trust the owner of that site.
Right. So you should completely trust the owner of this site from all accounts. He is 100% legitimate.
Well, his database only needs to have a flag that says password, credit card, whatever was exposed. It doesn't actually have to have those values.
Correct.
To do what he needs it to do.
Right. So we'll get into this because TRC panel, distinguished guest Barry, have we been pwned? Our individual @TRC podcast accounts? No. But like me, you guys probably don't use those email accounts very often.
Not to sign up for any services.
info@trcpodcast.com. This one we use for a few things. It's linked to our Twitter account and our Patreon account, but, Yeah, that hasn't been pwned either.
Great.
But of course, what we really want to know is, have our everyday primary email addresses been, quote, pwned? I'll go first. My current primary email account is only a few years old, and I'm happy to say it doesn't show up.
Wow, great.
But I have a secondary email account that is older, and I still use for many things, and I got 5 hits.
Wow.
It was contained in a 2012 Dropbox data breach, a 2013 Adobe data breach, a 2016 LinkedIn data breach, a 2015 QuinStreet data breach. They were running a site called FlashKit when I was doing Flash development, and a 2017 data dump from a spam operation. That last one is obviously just my email address, but the others all included passwords.
Wow.
Boy.
Barry.
Oh, yeah. Oh, boy.
2 breaches, the same Dropbox data breach and a more recent May 2017 breach of Zomato, the restaurant application some people might know better as Urban Spoon.
Okay, yeah, I actually, about a year ago, started using a password manager, and I'm somewhat regularly, I probably am a bit behind here, but somewhat regularly changing it to kind of a very difficult to crack password using the manager. So
Good for you.
Interesting.
hopefully that's no longer an issue.
Darren, the same Dropbox breach, the same LinkedIn breach, a 2016 breach of Daily Motion, a 2011 breach of an instant messaging service. Now, Adam, you're in the same boat as me, where you changed your primary email address a few years
Not
ago.
long ago, yes.
But you're still there. A 2017 breach of the site tvdb.com. And your older email address?
Yeah. Oh, that's going to be a ton of stuff.
The Dropbox breach, the Daily Motion breach, a 2014 Kickstarter breach, and a 2017 breach of the blog commenting service Discus.
Ooh.
So are you saying that the computer engineer has been the most hacked so far?
Well, I would say that, except your last. Christina.
Hit me.
Dropbox, LinkedIn, a 2018 breach of a sales engagement company called Apollo, a 2014 breach of Bitly, the URL management company, a 2015 breach at Patreon, a 2018 breach at Ticketfly, and a 2018 dump from a spam malware operation. Some of these dumps are just emails, but many also included passwords and other information. Yes, I know, those passwords are not usually in clear text, but maybe going back to me covering some of this stuff on a future show, things like rainbow tables and salting. Now, keep in mind, this isn't anything any one of us did. It's just that companies who had our information got compromised. Yeah. But it's meant to demonstrate that the reuse of passwords is not a good thing.
Yeah.
In conclusion, your accounts are going to get, quote, pwned. Pick better passwords and don't reuse them. Or even better, use a password manager. Change your passwords regularly. Sign up for haveibeenpwned.com. Now, many of us might not do much of that stuff, but maybe this short segment might make you think just for a second before you generate your next password.
Great job, Pat. Very important.
Absolutely.
Pat, I have a question. Could this website, the Have I Been Pwned, also be an indication? Because some companies, I mean, that's not exactly the news you want to get out to your shareholders that you've had a huge data breach. Is it possible that he could be catching this before it's even public knowledge?
No, because there are laws. If you've been, particularly in the United States, if you've been breached, there are laws that within a certain time you have to disclose to the people who have had their data breached.
Well, thank you, Pat. Thanks for joining us once again. Adam explored the terrible world of anti-vax that still rears its head, even in the lovely city of Toronto. It's not a national newspaper, but a popular newspaper.
Thanks, Andrew Wakefield.
Barry looked into some errors in textbooks, which you may not have known about, but it should have undermined your faith in education once again, and that's what we do at the show. Thanks, Barry. And then finally, Pat looked into the world of passwords and how many of us are compromised, and we should all just do a little bit more because it does actually matter.
Yeah.
Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
Thanks for having me.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.